Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Today we're going to be talking with Liz Cohen, who is the author of a wonderful new book called The Future of Tutoring, Lessons from 10,000 School District Tutoring Initiatives. I'm holding it in my hand right now for those of you who are watching. Really comprehensive, tells quite the story, and is a bit of a cliffhanger. We'll get into all of that in a bit, but before we do any of that, Liz, welcome to Trending in Education.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
You know, your book has been coming up in multiple conversations. I think this is not my first time I held it up. I happen to have it near me on a couple other conversations. Tutoring is something people have been talking about for years. It kind of heated up in a lot of interesting ways around COVID and the conversations around learning loss. How do we catch back up? We're going to get into all that later. We always like to start by getting to know you a little bit better. Can you catch folks up on who you are and your professional origin story?
Sure. Well, so I'm Liz Cohen, and when I'm not trying to write a book, I'm the Vice President of Policy at 50CAN. We're a national education advocacy organization that supports a network of state-based orgs. So we do really state-focused work, everything from direct advocacy and state capitals, parent organizing, all sorts of work. And we are in 11 states right now. But I've been working in education policy and research for 20 years.
Yeah.
And I've gotten to do a little bit of everything, to be honest. I've worked at a school district, at a state education agency. I have consulted for nonprofits and foundations. I've worked at consulting companies, working with ed tech companies. So I've gotten the tasting menu of education.
Yes, exactly. And while sampling what's out there, at some point you noticed and began exploring what's going on around tutoring. And, you know, tutoring goes all the way back, I believe, to Aristotle and Plato, if not further, in that it's a very natural kind of human dynamic for someone who has a little more knowledge to connect with someone who's earlier in their life and their experience and help them along the way. It's also very broad, you know, like tutoring can talk about like AI tools and homework help and lots of different things. There's a specific flavor of tutoring around high impact, still called by some folks, high-dosage tutoring.
Yep.
Can you tell the story of tutoring to get folks caught up on the area you're focused on?
Yeah.
And really what led you to write the book?
Yeah. And I mean, those things all are together. So there was this moment that really started, I think, in the summer of 2020. Schools had been closed, and there was this big question about would schools reopen for the fall. And, you know, just to take us back to that moment, even though a lot of us don't love to relive it, as a mom of three, there's lots of reasons why that's a complicated time. But there was this feeling in early July that schools would reopen. And then all of a sudden there was this feeling that actually in a lot of places schools were not going to reopen. And so immediately the conversation turned for a lot of folks in education of like, well, if we're going to keep schools closed again, we're going to need a plan. So what should we do? And so people sort of started saying, maybe some sort of tutoring. Could it be done? Because first of all, could you start it now? Could you do it in small groups? And this was still COVID.
This is when like learning pods were like a thing. This also learning loss was a thing.
Yeah. There was a longtime tutoring researcher, Bob Slavin out of Johns Hopkins, who really started leading this charge in that summer. He had spent his whole career researching tutoring initiatives and great learning programs, and he would sadly pass away suddenly in April 2021. But I always want to mention him by name because I really believe that he was one of the very first people out there. He wrote a piece called A Marshall Plan for American Education, which was his vision for how we could use tutoring to help support all kids coming out of the pandemic. And then fast forward a few months, and in February 2021, now President Biden, or then President Biden, became president in January, and he announces $129 billion for K-12 education. We have never had that kind of money. It's multiple times typical annual funding. And he told schools that they had to use 20% of it to do something academic. So we'd started with these whispers, and now we have all this money. And people started thinking like, well, what could we do this sort of tutoring thing with this money, and what would that look like? And then the other piece that really helped click it into place was that an updated version of a working paper, a research paper that had already been out, but they happened to be scheduled to publish in March 2021, a research paper showing a tutoring program called Saga that was used in Chicago public schools.
AJ Gutierrez, friend of the show, just had him on recently. Shout out to AJ. But
Shout out to AJ
yeah,
for sure, and his partner Alan Safran,
Alan.
who they ran Saga together for years. And in Chicago, they were working with low income kids at low income Chicago public high schools, and showed that with this in school tutoring program around Algebra 1, these students were gaining a year's worth of math, an additional year's worth.
Yeah.
And so that paper and the work that Saga have been doing sort of all led to this moment where everyone said, okay, let's start doing this thing.
Mhm.
And so part of why this story is so interesting is because we almost never are so unified in what we think is the solution, right?
Yeah.
And this idea that so we had funding and we had researchers and then we had advocates, folks like Kevin
Yeah.
Huffman, who had been a state commissioner of education in Tennessee. I got to interview him for the book, and he says, like, I was sort of sitting at home in Tennessee and thinking, wow, we're really going to have to do something. And he'll say, I didn't know anything about tutoring, but
Yeah.
everyone started saying this is something that actually works. And so then
Right.
he got on board and helped launch this other new organization. And so it was sort of everything started coming up tutoring. And when that happens as someone who's been watching trends in education, I mean, you, Michael Wang,
Yeah.
literally your podcast is called Trending in Ed. You're
Yeah.
like, oh, is this going to happen? And so
Mhm.
that was 21. By about 2 years later, based on the School Pulse panel that the U.S. Department of Education surveys schools about what they're doing, I mean, by 2 years later, about 80% of school districts reported doing some kind of tutoring,
Yeah.
which is about 10,000. And about 2/3 of those said they were trying to do this high impact or high dosage tutoring, which was
Yeah.
mostly inside the school day, at least 3 days a week for at least 30 minutes at times in small groups with a consistent adult.
Right.
And then we were just kind of off to the races of like, can we make this thing in the real world live up to the randomized controlled trial?
Right. Right. Exactly. And the fact that the RCTs, I'm an ex-Kaplan guy, so I love my 3-letter acronyms. The randomized controlled trials are kind of like the gold standard in research. Everyone wants to make sure the work they do in education is actually backed up by the research to make sure that it works. But then scaling that is always the next question. What's striking about this is it's almost like, I don't know what the positive analogy is for a perfect storm, but it was almost like everything kind of aligned in that it was a real problem, like the learning loss, and it's been reframed in other ways, but like kids were suffering, they're still suffering. We're looking at the
Yeah.
NAEP scores and what we're kind of getting caught up from, we're by no means out of the woods, but you had a real problem. You had evidence-based research that's saying tutoring makes this specific flavor of tutoring, which is important as well, like the things you outlined there, the fact that it's up to 4, which is also interesting. Lots of times people think it's, tutoring is just one-on-one, and it's almost like the dynamics of the small group are actually maybe a little better, and certainly the economics are a little easier. But the fact that that model made these meaningful impacts at the same time that the funding faucet was turned on
Yeah.
and then distributed to like 10,000 school districts, that's remarkable. And then we'll fast forward to kind of where we are today, because I think the way you outline what was going on across 10,000 cases. So congratulations on the comprehensiveness of the book. It's impressive to me that you were able to synthesize that all down into something that is coherent. But can you kind of catch us up from its start in COVID, the funding and some of the reaction and the opportunity around high impact tutoring? What has happened since, and where are we
Sure.
today?
So I think where we are now is, I think of it as a constellation, right? If you look at the night sky, there are a lot of stars out there for tutoring, and some of them are bright and constant and shining. And those
Mhm.
are districts that both committed very deeply in those years when we had all that funding into
Yeah.
really making this a sort of standout program for their district. And I'm thinking about places like Greensboro, North Carolina, Baltimore City, Washington, D.C. There's some others too. What we're seeing now is that the places that invested the most when they had that one-time federal dollars are the places that are working the hardest to continue the funding now. So we have these bright stars, and then we have, some others that sort of twinkle on and off, and they're twinkling on and off for a few different reasons. One is that implementation is just really hard, and that work never ends. And then one of the challenges in scaling I really have a complicated relationship with the word scaling. It's something that
Yeah.
we adopted from sort of the tech and business world. And
Yeah.
you can't scale with humans the way that you can scale
Fewer hockey sticks.
because there's some amount of the work. You can't get like a total efficiency because the
Mhm.
implementation work when you're talking about individual humans is just still
Yeah.
hard. So some places are figuring that out. A lot of the programs also, while there are a lot of them are pretty small. So, you could be a district doing tutoring and that could mean at one school,
Yeah.
25 kids are getting tutored. And that's exciting and great and also isn't going to make a big picture difference.
Right.
And so you have some of them are small, some of them are still struggling with implementation, some of them are struggling now with funding priorities.
Yeah.
And if the program wasn't sort of fully incorporated in sort of district strategy, and especially if teachers and school leaders weren't already bought in, it's now a much more complicated environment. I do think a really promising thing that's happened, which happened pretty quickly, was that most state and district leaders realized pretty quickly that sort of on-demand tutoring platforms, I'm using quotes around the word tutoring if you're listening in, we're not going to get you where you want to go, right? So
Right.
if you contracted for a tutoring system so that any student in your state can just log on whenever they need help, I just want to be clear that that's not the kind of tutoring that I'm
Yeah.
talking about has the research backing. And
Mhm.
most states have really stayed away from that, which I think is
Yeah.
great.
It's also
Uh,
that's a mode of tutoring that was almost directly hit by ChatGPT and a lot of the
yeah,
LLMs, like homework help. I don't really need to go to like a human live chat to ask them about my algebra homework when there's I mean, it's the Wild West, it's a separate conversation, but there's a lot of solutions out there that are kind of meeting that
right.
on-demand need, and that's
Yeah.
not really what we're talking about.
I mean, okay, so one of the other reasons that I wanted to write this book is because it's not actually because of tutoring, even though I'm really excited about tutoring and I talk about it all the time. It's because if you zoom out, like, why did most of us get into the work of education? It's because we want kids to have better opportunities. We want kids to learn more. We want to think differently about education. And I think what's actually the most exciting piece of the whole tutoring story is that it is a moment in time in which almost every adult involved in education said, let's try to do this new thing and let's
Mhm.
change a lot of the big pieces that
Yeah.
often are immutable. Let's change school schedules. Let's change who's allowed to interact with a kid in an educator type role. We changed all of these things because there was this sense of urgency around what happened in COVID. That means that we could do that again.
Yeah.
So that's like, I hope the tutoring work continues and we're going to keep talking about the ways
Yeah.
I see that going. But I also want to just say, like, to me, the most important piece is it shows an ability to make big changes in the public education system that's often seen as so anti-fragile that nothing can change it. But we
Yeah.
did change it. And that was the real kernel of what I wanted to capture.
Yeah. Nice job with anti-fragility. I'm a big fan of that concept. Comes up a lot. Futurist Roger Spitz talks about the Black Mirror effect, where people tend to think about the future in a dystopian lens. They think about how
Right.
everything's going to go sideways and bad. And that was certainly true, talking to people about education through the lens of the pandemic years, that there was a lot of concern and a lot of deficit framing, I guess, that became pretty normal. And we've even been talking about learning loss and some of the things that I try to be careful about. But it's real. The flip side is like there are these shining stars in your constellation, to extend your metaphor, but it seems like we're looking down a lot of the time. We're not actually looking up for
Yeah.
what's actually working. When we talk about what's working, one of the things that I think is really interesting about tutoring, another topic that comes up a lot on this podcast, is the future of work and what types of jobs will be there for humans. The workforce future of work angle around tutoring and around education is something that's been interesting to me. I was recently talking to Hallie Bowman at Saga about similar stuff, where it's like, who are these tutors and how might they make us think differently about the disruptions in the workforce, and how folks who care about education and want to kind of get into that space, tutoring's a pretty interesting thing that is emerging.
For sure. I think that I actually think one of the most exciting pieces of the future of tutoring is how we could think about engaging young adults in college or, 18 to 24 in these tutor type roles. I talk a lot about college students and also the AmeriCorps program. Some of the programs that I wrote about have now lost their AmeriCorps grant. And while I don't want to go into politics, I want to say that I think that there are specific cases where these AmeriCorps grants were leading to really measurable
Right.
important outcomes for kids, and would love for those folks to get their funding back, if I'm being honest. But in general, I like to joke that teacher union PR is so good that they have actually convinced everyone in the country that teachers don't get paid enough and aren't respected. And whether that's true or not, my point is it means that nobody wants to become a teacher. If
Right.
you look at surveys of parents, like more than half of parents in this country will say they do not want their own children to
Mm.
consider teaching. And that similar kind of things. Most young people, if you ask them, don't want to consider teaching because
Yeah.
they've heard they're not going to make any money and, they're not going to like it. And again, lots of things to fix. But what we've learned is that actually when you put young people, college students, and other young adults in a positive educational setting where they see that they're making the difference in the life of a young person, many of
Yeah.
them start considering,
Mhm.
oh, maybe this is something I want to do. And the
Right.
future of work we've known for already for decades is that you're probably not going to do one thing.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
the other thing I would say is like, be open to what's in front of you. But when you look at, so Teacher America launched a tutoring program in 2020, 2021. Really, it was launched by this woman who at the time was running the Arizona division of Teacher America. And she was really responding to what schools they were working with said, we're going to need some tutors. So now they're running this national program where they hire college students for 10-week sessions. They get paid a stipend to tutor for about 30 minutes a day, 4 days a week. And you get to pick the time. It's the same time every day so that you can,
Yeah.
they Zoom in virtually. Well, last year, something like 8% of first-year Teacher America teachers had already worked as tutors
Mm.
in the TFA program. And I
Yeah.
think those numbers have only continued to go up. And so what Teacher America and what I'm hearing anecdotally from other folks as well is seeing is that, again, when you give young people the opportunity to have this sort of positive educator type role with young people, they start thinking, oh, maybe this is something I want to do, maybe forever and maybe for some period of time. And
Yeah.
so I think that, with all the technology and AI, and we can talk about all the cool stuff that people are building because I love that stuff too. But
Yeah.
fundamentally, the story of tutoring in the last 5 years is actually a story about human relationships. And
Mhm.
whether that's because people were disconnected during the pandemic and wanted to reconnect, or just because human nature is
Yeah.
that we want to have relationships with other humans, at the heart
Mhm.
of this is that I think young people in America, like, and I'm talking even little kids from K on up,
Yeah.
turn on up, like, are hungry for meaningful relationships
Yeah.
with adults of all different ages.
Yes.
The more that we can build more human relationships, whether that's in person or one-on-one on a Zoom screen like we are right now, is
Yeah.
maybe a good thing, I
Yeah.
think.
I agree.
So that part of it is also just like, let's do more. Let's do more
Yeah.
humans talking to humans.
Exactly. I mean, it seems obvious, but it is interesting. It's amazing that there is an evidence base now that shows that it works. I always come back to, I think it was Alan Safran when he was on the show, said, kids don't care what you know until they know that you care. And then AJ Gutierrez was catching me up a lot about research on mattering, where kids want to feel like they matter. And one of the ways that you feel like you matter is when an adult knows you, they know your name,
Right.
they know your story. And that was really striking to me where, to your point, like I think lots of times when we think about tutoring, we get very like curricular and wonky about, eighth grade algebra scores and like all that stuff is real. But what actually moves the needle frequently is the motivation of knowing that someone who I'm trying to earn and maintain their respect and, their relationship in my life, they want me to do well on this thing. I
Right.
want to kind of live up to their expectations for me. I'm even willing to be pushed a little to kind of get there. All those things they're non-cognitive, they're more relational, emotional, motivational. And I think it's a unique situation where you have almost like the heart-based delivery connected to the evidence, the data, which is a real positive story, which is why I'm happy that you're showcasing it and we're talking about it now, because I feel like people may be missing the fact that this is like a collective aha moment that has come. But you mentioned teachers unions and, like some of the challenges around our school districts. I'm the parent of a 6-year-old here in Brooklyn, who's got plenty of upside around his educational experience, but it's kind of rigid model that is pretty similar to what it's been over the years. And then the funding that was a one-time thing in response to the pandemic is gone now.
Yep.
what about that aspect of where we are today? It seems this is the whole cliffhanger element where, maybe we could talk more about what might be on the horizon, but it does seem like we're at a very critical moment in this story, which is why I think the timing of the book is great in that what do we do now and how do we kind of get us to a better tomorrow?
Yeah. Okay, so before I answer that, I want to add one piece to what you were saying about motivation, which
Yeah.
is a yes and, which is that when you actually look at the science of learning around motivation, motivation is actually derived from being able to show competence.
Hmm.
And one of the mistakes that I think that we made coming out of COVID was that we thought if we made things easier for kids, it would help
Hmm.
them re-engage in school. And I
Yeah.
think that's been shown to be wrong. And I think that part of the I don't have evidence on this. This is my own hypothesis, but I
Yeah.
wonder if part of the power of tutoring is that providing an opportunity for kids to engage in the kind of productive struggle that learning
Yeah.
science says they need in a supported environment where they can show that competence is also why it's building their motivation and connection
Yeah.
to the tutor, right? Like, so David Yeager is a psychologist at the University of Texas, Austin, and he wrote a book last year on the science of motivating young people. And he
Hmm.
talks about having high standards and high support and
Hmm.
and marshals a lot of evidence of different teaching practices around how this is really. And so one of the things I've been wondering is that if really effective tutoring is also a way of getting at this high standards, high support environment that we have
Yeah.
lots of other evidence that also shows. So I do think the motivation piece is important. I don't think it's totally disconnected to the
Yeah.
academics.
That makes sense. Yeah, it reminds me of even some of the research I've seen into, charter schools like Success Academy and like the whole notion of
Yeah.
like rigor and the fact that it's a caring environment, but also with high standards.
Yeah.
And it just gets back to that question of, many school districts are struggling just to, you know, staff their classes and deal with funding shortfalls.
Yeah.
And tutoring is not cheap. Like it actually requires spend, which is why I start thinking about the future of education, where like if you didn't have the existing model and you were to design fresh with some of the evidence around how effective tutoring is,
Yeah.
what might you build? I guess that's one way of thinking about it. But then you maybe think about it that way so that you can then say, all right, well, we may not be doing that. Although I know you've done research into school choice and some of the other initiatives in education. So like there are new models. Alpha School is something I talk about a lot, which is maybe a little closer to some of the high impact tutoring model, but more for the majority of students out there in the US today who are going to be going to a traditional K-12 experience of some kind. How do you see this playing forward? What are some future scenarios, positive,
Sure.
negative, around getting titular the future of tutoring?
Right. Okay, so let's start with the most bleak. Like one bleak scenario is that this all sort of falls to the wayside and,
Yeah,
5, 10 years down the road, we occasionally say, hey, remember when we tried to do that tutoring thing and it fizzled out.
right.
And I think we've seen that happen with many other
Yeah. It's
pieces of
almost
it.
an austerity scenario, right? Because the main reason why I could see that happening is they just don't have the funding, and it almost seems like things would probably get worse in other ways.
Right. But I guess I would say that what I hope if people are like, oh, is that going to happen? I mean, maybe it's austerity, but it's also a choice
Yeah,
because we do get to choose how we spend the money that we have. And
yeah,
we know, right? I mean, especially, right? We're talking about the ed tech world, how many ed tech products and software licenses are purchased and never used. We have a
yeah.
poor track record in education of spending money
Yes.
effectively and
Yeah.
efficiently. And so I would say, I don't think tutoring has to be the answer for every single school or district, but I do
Right.
think that every single school or district needs to be able to tell parents, what are you doing to ensure that every kid in your building is learning? And what are you doing to support the kids who need additional help?
Yeah.
And I think that, we are in this moment of parent empowerment, of parents being more engaged than ever, of demanding more from schools that came
Yeah.
after the pandemic. And so I think that being able to say, well, we offer, these tutoring programs inside the school day or after school, whatever, I think that's a great response, but that has to be in service of your overall strategy. So you could take a Success Academy. They're not doing high impact tutoring, but they don't need high impact tutoring. They have a strategy. It's
Mm.
not going to, maybe it's not the right fit for every child, but for the children who choose to go there and if it works for them, they don't need it. But
Yeah.
if you take a place like Louisiana as a whole state, like Louisiana is in the midst of an incredible overhaul of how they're
Yes.
teaching early reading and
Hmm.
math in particular. And if you look really at the elementary school, they're doing tutoring. This year, Louisiana is tutoring something like 240,000 kids. Okay.
Yeah.
But they're not just tutoring to tutor, they are tutoring because they set into place high quality instructional materials,
Yeah.
new kinds of teacher training, instructional coaches. And then they wrote into law that if kids aren't on grade level, they are required to get high impact tutoring. And the state put money into it. That's true. But this is in service, tutoring in service of a strategy. And so
Yeah.
that to me is the scenario that I hope we can get more schools and districts, because I want everyone to be able to say, I want us to be honest about what's working and what's not working, and the fact that a lot of what we're doing isn't working. And then
Yeah.
I want us to say what's our goal and what are the strategies we're using, and then what are the tools that support those strategies. And you should have tutoring on the table, but there could be other tools, but you got to tell me you got a tool. And
Yeah.
tinkering around the margins or not, New York City's like class size shenanigans is not going to get anyone where they actually want to go. We're never going to be able to just build the new house of education. I think about this
Yeah.
all the time. Like the thing you said, like if I could blow it all up and start over, what would I build?
Right.
And like the really hard part is, if you've ever been involved in a renovation, is you like hit this part of like, well, am I actually going to move out of my house for 9 months and disrupt
Right.
everything about my life for this
Hmm.
better product on the outside? But if you are willing to put up with the discomfort of
Hmm.
changing everything, because you're literally going to go live somewhere else for a while, you can come back to something that remarkably changes your quality of life.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of us out there who want to do that in education. And, I'd love to think of this as sort of a door into exploring a bigger renovation scope of work.
And then for district leaders who are frequently the audience that some of these books, need to reach, they're juggling a lot. I'm also getting to know school boards, which is a whole
Sure.
nother thing that kind of surfaced around the awareness and interest in school boards is something that has sort of popped a bit since the pandemic. But I think for folks in those types of roles who are thinking about at the district level, which is where change happens in schools generally, what's your advice for them? Like, there's plenty of examples in your book. I mean, one piece of advice would be pick up the Future of Tutoring, lessons from 10,000 school district tutoring initiatives. Also, if you have someone involved in K-12 school leadership, the holidays are coming. It's great stocking stuffer. But for folks who haven't read the
Yeah.
book or kind of want to get a sense of what your recommendations are, what would you say to that audience?
So one thing we know about school districts, so like if you're a school district leader out there, is we know you like to think about who looks like me as a district and what is it they're doing. And
Yeah.
one of the wonderful outcomes of the fact that so many folks have been doing this work is that there are, for almost everyone, an example of some district who looks like them who has had some success with tutoring. So
Yeah.
first I would say, like, happy to help anybody try to figure out, who should I be looking at? Am I
Yeah.
in Ector County, Texas? Am I Milpitas Unified, which is a pretty small district in the Bay Area that's done a really effective after-school tutoring program?
Mhm.
Most school districts are not behemoth, but there's lots of examples out there. So one is
Yeah.
like, who can you look to? But again, I would say, like, if this is in service of your goal, you got to get the buy-in is the most important. And I think some of the great practices I've seen around that involve really starting from the beginning to get your school leaders bought in. So I think Ector County in particular did a really great approach. So when they decided to start a tutoring program, they put out an RFP and they narrowed it down to 5 contenders, and they invited all principals. It was optional, but they invited every principal in their district to attend sort of an interview Zoom call with each of the 5. And then
Yeah.
principals were allowed to vote. And then ultimately the district chose 2 of the vendors. And then they said to principals, if you're going to opt into tutoring, you have to choose one of these 2 vendors, but you can choose which of the 2 vendors. And I
Yeah.
think that those steps of inviting principals, not all of them participated, but it just showed that the district understood
Hmm.
that these were the people who were going to have to really lead on it. And to
Yeah.
get them bought in from the beginning was
Hmm.
going to be important, because then also, the other piece of it is the teachers, and what are you actually asking of teachers,
Right.
and how
Right.
are you framing this for teachers as something that is supportive. I mean, one of the biggest issues with teachers we know right now is just burnout and
Hmm.
frustration, that teachers came back, after COVID to classrooms with much wider sets of needs and demands. And I think that if you can show teachers, because you're implementing tutoring in a thoughtful way, that it's actually going to make their classroom run better, right?
Yeah.
Because it's going to help them get kids more able to follow their core lesson
Yeah.
plan. Or
It's
some,
connected. I mean, that's the
yes.
thing that, I've been around tutoring in different capacities throughout my career, and I've heard it described as it's like a shadow educational system because people frequently don't know who has private tutoring. And then even the teachers frequently don't know what their kids are getting. And then the private tutoring that exists generally is expensive and more affluent families get it. And teachers don't really know anything about it. This form of tutoring is very different in that it's in the school day. Kids already are learning in their regular classes, and then they go to their high impact tutoring. When done well, what the tutors are doing connects back to what the teachers are doing in
Yeah.
class. That's an important distinction.
For sure. And also the point you made, I mean, private tutoring, the demand for private tutoring only continues to increase. And this has
Hmm.
been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, by 2015 or so, there were already like 9,000 private tutoring centers in the United States,
Yeah.
and almost all of them are located in affluent communities.
Yeah.
There's been like real research on this to show this. But at 50CAN, my organization, we actually did a survey of 20,000 nationally representative parents last year. We asked them a whole bunch of questions. But one of the questions we asked them was like, does your child get any tutoring? And more than 40% of the families who make $500,000 a year or more said their
Mm.
kid is getting tutoring. And we believe that most of that is outside of school. And then
Yeah.
because the lower income families in the survey, it's like 16%.
Yeah.
And so if you're doing this work because you care about closing achievement gaps or you care about equity or any of this, the access to high quality academic support outside of school
Yeah.
is going to continue to drive these things farther
Yeah.
and farther
Right.
apart.
Right.
And so I think that if you want to say, well, why do we think more affluent kids continues to succeed? I mean, there's lots of reasons why that, we know income is correlated with all sorts of positive outcomes, but one of them is definitely that their parents are able to pay for
Yeah.
tutoring when they need
Mhm.
it. And
Right.
whether that is ongoing, every Tuesday you go to Kumon or whatever it is, or whether it's, I mean, my neighborhood listserv that where I live in Maryland, every day someone's like, I need a physics tutor, I need
Right.
a Spanish tutor for my kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that is a big piece of it too.
It kind of gets back to your point earlier where, kids need to feel that sense of competence and accomplishment. And whether it's with their tennis instructor or their swim coach, the kids who have access
Yeah.
to resources frequently have those positive experiences. Someone's focused on me. My 6-year-old's in chess now and he loves it. And it's partly because it's social, but it's also they're paying attention to what he's doing and that it's hard. He's losing, but like he's
Sure.
learning because they're giving him feedback. And that seems like one of the bigger takeaways here is that how do we get more of that integrated into everything that we do from an
Right.
educational perspective? And schools really are the front lines of that. So that's where it does
Yeah.
seem like a Reese's peanut butter cup connection
Right.
between where you deliver this is in the schools, and then what has worked outside of the schools needs to be kind of integrated in a new way. Where does this go? Like, AI, we haven't gone, we
Okay.
haven't talked Conmigo. We haven't
Yeah.
talked about, I like to call it Clippy's Revenge, where like the AIs are coming back and now they have new
Sure.
tools, particular set of skills. So shout
Yeah.
out to Liam Neeson. We're getting closer to time here. Definitely check out the book, our listeners, if you are curious. But Future of Tutoring.
Yeah. So what is the future of tutoring and
Yes.
what's the role of technology in that?
Oh,
So there's just no escaping it. I mean, I write in the book that I'm not going to write about AI because everyone knows this has been evolving so rapidly.
yeah.
I think there's some really cool stuff being built. I think that like one sort of reasonable vision for the future of tutoring in the next 5 years is that actually maybe all kids could have access, like I'm talking about elementary for right now, like to
Yeah.
a pretty high quality, inexpensive AI tutoring experience
Hmm.
that I think will be enough for some kids to help keep them on track.
Yep.
Like, hot tip to builders out there is that it's got to be fun because they've got to
Yeah.
want to do it, right?
Right. Right.
Like, there's a study that actually just came out last week from Stanford looking at disruption time in virtual tutoring and showed that 81% of time was actually being spent on instruction and 19% on others, which I actually think overall is pretty good.
And just
But about 7% of the disruptive time was students messing around or doing other things or whatever pieces. And I would say like one thing I really want builders to think about is like, how are you going to make sure that students stay in the program? And it has to be good enough while also being rigorous. But I actually think these are things that awesome people are thinking about. And so maybe everybody has an AI piece that's 20 minutes of a day. And for some kids, that's enough. And then for some kids, they're going to need something more than that. They're going to need human tutoring.
Yeah.
And that's where I would love to really leverage college students and also folks in teacher prep programs. There's about 500,000 people a year enrolled in some kind of education program. If
Yeah.
all of them were serving in some ways as tutors, that would give us 500,000 tutors a year that we
Hmm.
could leverage in a lot of different ways. So I think that's one piece of it. And the other piece that I think I'm excited about is that there's a lot of momentum around building AI-based tutor coaches. So
Mm.
really recognizing that the
Yes.
human relationship is core and saying, how do we help tutors be better at tutoring? And so there's
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of really exciting momentum there. And there was one study that showed that this was a specific program, but in this one AI tutor coach that would make suggestions to the tutor based on what was happening in the session. That was a virtual session on, ask this question. Oh, they said this response. Now you could follow up with this. That it essentially took out the entire learning curve of being a first year tutor.
Mm.
And it really made it so that like the sort of penalty of your novice tutor year would no longer exist. So if
Yeah.
we can get to a place where technology can also help the humans be even better at
Mm.
this thing that we actually already know they can be pretty good at,
Yeah.
that seems really exciting to me too. So I'm really interested in the tutor facing stuff. And I think there's going to be some cool AI stuff, but I really want to be patient until those tools are really ready to be aligned with curriculum, that teachers understand this, that they have to be used with regularity, all these dosage. I don't, better to sort of measure twice and cut once on
Nice.
really going
Yeah.
big with these AI tools than risk like having teachers get burned on them.
Hmm. Lots to chew on there. Absolutely. And then we haven't had a chance to talk about outcomes-based contracting, which is for the wonkier implementation people who are curious about it, but it's important. Can you give us a quick hit on what outcome-based contracting is?
I think it's not just for the wonks, it's for anyone who actually cares about responsible use of taxpayer funds.
There you
And
go.
so the idea is that instead of paying for something and then hoping it gets used well, you set up a contract that's based on the outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
Hmm.
And so with tutoring is actually really perfectly aligned for this kind of contracting because you can say we're going to give kids a test at the beginning and the goal is for them to score, 10 points higher.
Yeah.
There's way more sophistication that goes into it, but that's the general idea.
Yeah.
And the way the contracts are set up is that the vendor gets some kind of flat fee. And then depending on how close they get to the targets, they get more money. And so
Yeah.
what it means is that, so for instance, Duval County, Florida did an outcomes-based contract around tutoring. And I think something like 55 to 60% of the kids hit the targets. And so you might say, well, but that's only about a little more than half the kids. Is that worth it? And what I would say to you is that, well, certainly worth it for those kids.
Yeah.
And because they did outcomes based, the district didn't pay the full amount. So
Yeah.
they kept a couple $1 million that they could then use to figure out,
Hmm.
okay, what do we need to change and how do we do it
Yeah.
differently?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of folks, I want to say that the for-profit ed tech side doesn't always have the best reputation on sort of the policy and district side, but the folks that have been out there leading on outcomes-based contracting, a lot of them are, just ed tech companies who are willing to put their money where their mouth is
Yeah.
because they believe in the product that they've created. So
Right.
and I can list any number of companies that are doing that. And I just think that to me is real leadership and really showing that you believe in, what it is that you're building. And so I also think that as we're in this more resource constrained time,
Yeah.
I would encourage school districts to think about this. It requires more work on the front end for
Hmm.
sure, but the back end means that you know that you're paying for what you got. And if
Yeah.
you didn't get what you were hoping for, instead of having, literally a closet full of unused laptops that was found in a New Jersey district a few years ago,
Right.
you would actually have money in your bank account that you could then use for something else.
Yeah. Incentives alignment and accountability and a little bit of extra gas in the tank when maybe you fall short in some places. Interesting stuff. And then, as we conclude here, I know you cover things beyond tutoring and you were kind of touching on it earlier. Are there takeaways for people who maybe aren't as close to the particulars of tutoring and K-12 education, things that tutoring is surfacing that are maybe recommendations from a policy perspective or ways of working, ways of thinking that you think are worth noting?
First of all, I think one important takeaway is that kids want to learn.
Mm,
And I think that we don't always think that kids want to learn, but I think
mhm,
kids do want to learn. And I think we can think about whether that's creating opportunities for kids to move faster, for those who are willing to move faster, and
mm,
how that could continue to engage kids. And I think there's some real opportunities there. When
yeah,
we look at our reading and math test scores, it's just, they're very bad. And it's
yeah,
very hard not to think maybe it's worth trying to do the thing that works. Tutoring is really one of those things. And we've
yeah.
known this for a really long time. I mean, Roland Fryer, who's a Harvard economist, did a study in Houston 10 years ago where he tested like all the big things, things around teachers, things around class size, things around tutoring. And the tutoring got the biggest effect size by far in terms of impacting student achievement. So,
Mhm,
I mean, you don't have to do tutoring, but if you're trying to fix math, you might want to consider it. If you're trying to
yeah,
fix literacy, you might want to consider it. And
right.
if you're trying to, help high school students figure out like, what do I want to do? And do I actually care about high school at all? Like, there's ways that people are thinking about that too. There's opportunities around mentorship. Not all tutoring has to be purely academic.
Yes.
I think in high school, there's some real opportunities, again, to build on that need for human connection that we
Mhm,
know that too many adolescents aren't getting. So, can you
yeah,
make it around mentorship? Can you make it around college and career prep? But in
yes,
a way that is tied to having someone out there who sees, okay, this is Michael, and this is
yeah,
what Michael's into, and that has value.
yeah.
And I want to help you think about, where you want to go with that.
Yeah, and it's a win-win too. I think about some of the things people say about Gen Z. It's like they want to give back and they're trying to find their footing professionally to be able to help someone who's not as far along and get paid for it and understand new potential professional pathways that are probably, future proof in some ways. There's a lot of positives to be had there. There's a lot to learn in the book. One more time, the name is The Future of Tutoring: Lessons from 10,000 School District Tutoring Initiatives. Liz Cohen is the author. Liz, it's been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
And for our listeners, if you liked what you heard, we'll include links to the book in the show notes. Subscribe, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.